I hope every.
Yeah, just hopefully another year and I can get through all of the different things. So,
All right, here we go. All right, welcome everybody. We should be live on YouTube right now. Let me just hit record on Zoom as well. Let me shut off the YouTube. Shut this off so I don't hear my echo. Okay, welcome everybody on YouTube. We got Gary Wayne, Mr. Gary Wayne from Genesis6conspiracy.com. Such a pleasure to have Gary. Let me get a little bit later light so that doesn't help. Such a pleasure to have Gary with us today. Gary and I actually have been doing shows for a long time together. I think it's since about 2014 or 2015. 2015, I think we've been doing shows together ever since. So it's really a pleasure to have him actually on camera and video because we've been doing it on radio. And about a couple of months ago, Gary and I started doing these on video as well. And I think it's a real treat to have him here. Gary also is always willing to answer any questions in the chat room that you might have. So on YouTube, if you're joining us live in the chat room, you can field me the questions and I will direct them to Gary as we're going along. We should be here for at least an hour. So guys, we have questions throughout the whole thing. If you want, when we get a chance, I'll jump in and ask Gary. Try to keep the questions to the topic until we're done. Maybe at the end we can field a few questions that you just want to shoot any question at all, and then we can get Gary. Of course, once again, Gary is at Genesis6conspiracy.com. I don't know why my light, get better light there. I don't like the shadow this thing is doing with the light. Let me just shut it off. I don't like the shadow that thing is doing. It's too close to me. All right. So, Gary, thank you for joining us today. We're getting a full chat room joining us in YouTube already. So it's really Excellent. A pleasure to have you here.
Excellent. Happy to be back. And spring is pretty much here. And so it's hopefully things start to improve on the world scene a little bit. But I think everything that we'll probably talk about today hopefully sheds light on some of the things that are out there and the bigger sort of concepts, and people are sort of struggling to say, where are we in time? What's going on? What does this mean? All of these conversations are designed to help a little bit in that. So I think hopefully the audience will like what we're going to talk about today, and I think we're going to give them some things that will give them some pause for thought, which is sort of always the goal, I think.
I agree 100%, Gary. And I thought today would be good since we've never talked about it on video before. We went into it a little bit on radio the other night, but I thought it would be good to talk about the solar kings, the Hyksos, the Hyksos, or however you, what's the correct way to pronounce that? I always say Hyksos or Hyksos. I'm not sure exactly.
Depends on which historian that you're referencing. And, you know, it's like so many of the names out of history is that they pronounce it differently. And you're saying, well, maybe I've been pronouncing it different for years. And, you know, sometimes there's different spellings, and that's just the nature of the game. So my understanding is Hyksos. But I have heard Hyksos, or Hyksos, as it could be some of the other spellings of it. But Hyksos tends to be how the Y is used with an H and or a C following, or a K depending on the spelling. So
yeah, I wonder if the slang word hick actually comes from that, because it's like some shepherds from the hills.
Well, right. It's certainly a good possibility, because it's a compound word, right? So
yeah,
it's but typically hick goes back to a king or a ruler in terms of if it's etymology, but they are from
not
the
mountains.
Peasant
from the hills.
So
it's not an uneducated peasant from the hills, right?
Yeah, they were enslaving the people of the hills that weren't of the bloodlines. They're not, and probably doing some other nasty things to them as well. So, but it's interesting. I mean, I'm not sure. I haven't done a check as to where that hick sort of comes from, but every time I dig into a common expression, it kind of makes my hair stand straight up sometimes in terms of how the heck did some of these expressions get into our language. So who knows what hick actually means? If somebody's done an etymological search on it, maybe they'll put it in the chat room, but I've not done one on that. So but yeah, so typically, when we're talking about the Hyksos, that's going to mean king or a ruler, and it has a Sumerian sort of tradition to it as well. That's not HYK, but it's more from an ug, as in a UG, as in a K in Sumerian is often spelled with a G, even though it would have a K sound. So, but it's got some interesting connections to King Og, right? As OWG, as you would spell that, and that's where it comes out of Hebrew.
Isn't there a more lesser way of saying even Anunnaki, like Anunnaki?
Yes. Sometimes it's spelt with a G. So it's and Uruk, which Gilgamesh and Nimrod and Lugalbanda and many others were kings of. That is also can be spelled as Unug, UNUG in the older languages as well. So that G is something to be aware of if you're ever dealing with some of the different older kind of transcripts and writings in terms of some of the Sumerian sort of aspects. And that second part of the word, as in sos, can be Egyptian for sheep. It can also be shepherd, as that comes out of some of the more, I guess, Middle Eastern, or say west of or east of Egypt, so to speak. So typically it's understood as a shepherd, to do with shepherds, and a shepherd king, which is a very, very odd sort of expression for Rephaim and giant and Aryan kings to be called.
It really is.
Yeah, it's absolutely, but it's got to do with the religion, right? It's got to do with who they are. But before we get into some of that, I had done a show on Fomorians a while ago with a fellow out of England, because he's never really heard anybody had done a show on it. So we could talk about that. So when we're talking about how there were these one-eyed sort of deformed giants, and they connect back to Scythia and Greek as being the earlier migration into Ireland after the flood, when the Tuatha Dé Danann would come in and replace them afterwards. And that there's another group of sort of giants, that's the Cyclops, that are also have one eye. And I think the Fomorians were descendants from the Cyclops. I think is probably the more likely sort of where they would come from. And so what's interesting, though, to make that connection is that the original ones were like three gods, right? They were some sort of physical presence made by the gods with interesting sort of names, but they also had sex with human females in the mythology. And then they created a lower god, or a Nephilim-like creature that became known as the Cyclops. And what's interesting about that is they work. There's a mythology with Odysseus, where they're involved with Odysseus in a partnership in terms of what they're doing on one of their quests and things like that. And they were called the uncivilized shepherds. And of course, these are dark-haired versions, very hairy, as opposed to the light-haired ones with the red and the blonde hair, and more akin to the Aryans that moved into the Indus Valley, into Persia, and whom the Hyksos come out of, except that the Hyksos obviously have two eyes. But it's interesting that they were uncivilized shepherds, I guess because they were living off by themselves and were ranching and herding, which is kind of unusual in itself. So I'm not sure what the meaning of that is, but I just look at the connections that there's probably something there that I haven't been able to pinpoint as to how they're connected to the Persians as well. But they do seem to be the Fomorians that migrated to Ireland.
Wow. You would think like, where does the red head come in then if they were the ones? But it might be a different Nephilim race that brought the red hair, like the King Og of Bashan.
Yeah, the Tuatha De Danann had red hair, right? And it's not that the Fomorians disappeared; they actually intermarried into the ones that survived, or intermarried with the Tuatha De Danann and other waves of people migrating to Ireland after that. But all were basically Scythians and Greek sort of orientated, or Trojan area, or however you want to phrase that.
Yeah, so, well, a lot of Scythians have the red hair for sure. Yeah. And it's interesting because what I've read about the Fomorians is just that the very name Fomorians would like strike fear. When people would hear the name, it would strike fear in them. They would like, urinate themselves just hearing the name.
Well, and they became these ferocious spirits after they died too. So they were just by the complete sort of definition were, Nephilim or Rephaim, because of their spirits were terrorizing people after their deaths. So there's a long sort of history of these Fomorian spirits throughout the Irish history. So it's interesting, and as with everything that the more you dig in, the more connections that you find. But there's not a lot written about the Fomorians. I mean, you basically get that out of a couple of books, one being the Labor Gabala, and then another one that's about the wars of the Tuatha De Danann. So only two major sort of writings that I was able to find anything out on, but it's just that they came from, they're legendary, had to have migrated out of that Greek Scythia area, and so it seems to me they're deeply connected into that whole sort of, most people would say 4 groups of Aryans, but this one leaves me open to the possibility there's a 5th group.
Yeah, I mean, that's really incredible, because I would say there's probably more that we don't even realize, more groups that we don't even realize. It could be even more, because we have all sorts of groups that from, the Aryans led to the Persians, the Kassites, the Hittites, the Kurds.
Lots of branches as it comes down. I mean, just the amount of time that's passed, and the intermarriage, and new dynasties and new nations and new tribes and things, it just sort of makes it one, difficult to follow unless you can sort of trace things sort of back, but it starts to answer sort of a lot of questions. So just while we're on them, they were like one-eyed giants, and large round eye, which is really kind of interesting, and
set in the middle of their head too,
right in the middle of their heads. And so they had human bodies, but sometimes they're depicted with a goat or a horse's head, which is kind of okay. That's starting to go into a kind of a weird sort of direction.
And when you usually have eyes in front like that, you're a predator that hunts.
Yeah, exactly. And
like one eye right in the front, in the middle is like a laser beam hunter.
Yeah. So they're thought of as, when they died, as the spirits of the earth and or demonic pirates, if you could. And why pirates? But they were the more and connected somehow to the sea gods as well. So, but anyways, we're not doing a show on the Fomorians, but it's just interesting that when we're talking about shepherd kings, and we're talking about Aryans, and we're talking about dark-haired ones, there's another line that were understood as uncivilized shepherds.
Well, is I'm not sure if I remember one before, but was Enki like the first shepherd that we see, basically? In
Um,
in, in one of the first shepherds that we see get called a shepherd, because I think he was referred to as a shepherd as well.
yeah, yeah, but that's more from being at the sort of head of the pantheon, right?
Yeah.
Right. So if you look at in the solar cults, and of course the Hyksos were part of the solar cult, as most of the religions were. They had the king as the representative of the solar deity, particularly in fertility rituals, right? So he would take on the same sort of motif as the god. So those would be typically the sun god was the one that was sort of looking after their people, right?
He
As a
was the
shepherd
shepherd
for
king.
their people and a keeper for their people, and also which sort of also led to why there would be sacrifices to the sun god so that their people would continue to be shepherded by that god. So yeah, if you
Just
really
like the
want to,
shepherd takes care of his stock, right?
yeah,
His flock.
yeah. So if you want to take it sort of back to its root, that's, I think it goes right back to the sun gods, and then the demigods would take on that as the divine representative of the pantheon on Earth, would take on that same sort of imagery.
Wow. Isn't that really true how livestock works too? The shepherd has the like the flock there, or with
Yeah,
and everything, right? And then one by one gets sacrificed,
yeah,
right? To
yeah,
keep them all in line. They stay in line
yeah.
and each one gets sacrificed one by one.
Yeah, and
Wow.
again, it's an odd mix because I mean, when you're talking about these um, warrior kings as being called shepherd kings as well, that's almost like an oxymoron.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
typically, when you've got sort of two sides to that expression, you've got a shepherd and a hunter. And typically the warriors were the hunters, just as Nimrod was a mighty one and a mighty hunter, right? And so that was sort of part of their whole military sort of makeup. And a hunter feeds off of the victim. A shepherd looks after the community of people. So, but yet it's meshed together. And in a lot of traditions, this goes back to before the flood with these fisher kings, with these priest kings and the
And
shepherd
this
kings.
is the Vedic war, basically, the two sides. This
Yeah,
is the root of it
yep,
all. Yeah.
yeah, I think it is. And coming out of sort of a mix of Old Testament and Gnostic beliefs. You have coming out with the Gnostics and with Cain that he would have been considered the second priest king. Adam would be the first, but it's the lineage is passed on down through Cain, and he and his descendants are going to intermarry with the original Nephilim. And so you've got that priestly sort of aspect that's coming down. Then you've got the development of Cain that's being more of a warrior, hunter type of individual, and then interbreeding with the descendants of his descendants, interbreeding with angels to create the Nephilim, and then they're going to sort of carry on with that bloodline. And that's the other thing that sort of connects in is that these were bloodline shepherd kings. These were bloodline priest kings, just as the Fisher king, as it sort of gets transposed into King Arthur legends with the Fisher king, and that will eventually move down the road into with the Merovingians as part of their title, who also looked like the Hyksos, by the way, in terms of their depictions.
Yeah.
But that sort of represented the last king of a long dynastic line that's trying to preserve that bloodline. And sort of the story that's going into it is that King Arthur is that last bloodline of the Tuatha De Danann, but then there's Percival that comes along, who's kind of the solution, and also takes his bloodline back to Joseph of Arimathea, as that tradition goes, and then back to Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
he's going to be the next sort of Fisher king. And in that lineage, you also have the Elan that are woven into the King Arthur's, and the Elan are Scythians as well, a different set of people. And again, there's many migrations of the Scythians throughout Europe, and the Merovingians are also connected in the bloodlines to the Elan.
Sure.
And Elan, Alain, in plural with the S on it, that actually shows up in a lot of sort of symbolic names in King Arthur, anything to do with Ellen or names like that. And there's several different versions of Alain as it's woven into King Arthur, is representative of that bloodline. And they were considered a Fisher king and a Grail king, like the next generation after, when Joseph of Arimathea takes Josephus to Glastonbury. And so they're projecting that bloodline. So the point of the matter is not to take the show again down to a King Arthur, but understand that
we got to do a whole show on King Arthur. That's it. It settles it.
It is. It's a great show to do, believe me, and because there's just so much that's in there. And
next show we'll do that.
Yeah. So these were dynastic bloodline kings that were going back to the original representatives as the sun god. That's why King Arthur was considered a representative of the sun god. Right.
Yeah. And I wonder if that comes from Vedic knowledge as well, because the Ella that you're saying, or Ela, it's in Vedic, you have Ila, like Ela.
Yeah. Yes.
That's and even there's a Hindu Naga, Ila Patra, but it's spelled with an E, L.
Yeah.
Ila Patra.
Well, because if you take that sort of and split that out, it's Elohim, which could easily just be spelled Elohim as well, as in Elohim, right? As you take that back. So when you look at the word IL or ILU or AL or EL or ALLAH, which is a feminine version of AL, those are all different transliterations for what's known in Hebrew as an angel or a god in polytheism, right? So,
or of the gods,
yeah, with Elohim being sort of the plural. So when you look at that Elohim, as it would have been originally formed, it has a lot of connections sort of back to being people of the gods.
Yeah, I agree, and I hate to jump all the way to Jesus, but like you were bringing certain things up that I gotta go into it for a little bit, because we have Jesus that's talked about as the good shepherd, right? And he's also talked about as a fisher of men.
Yes.
So he's got both the fisher king and the shepherd title that goes along with it. So can we get into that? Because could it be possible that God said, these bloodlines with this knowledge are corrupted, I'm sending a pure fisher king to be like the new man through that line? So could it be that he came to maybe purify that knowledge and bring like a new, and then we killed him, for Christ's sakes? He was going to be a new prototype for a new man on the planet, maybe, possibly, and then look what we did to him.
Well, I think there's a lot of crossover in terms of the terminologies in polytheism and monotheism, right? And we've talked about that in a lot of shows. Yeah.
Even the name Christ, could it be a title, Gary? Because like Christ almost sounds like a Christalis, like a new.
Well, it's a Greek word. It's a Greek word that's been used to try and understand the term Messiah, right, or Messiah, and so a Christos would be a polytheist understanding of that.
It's almost like the word gold too. It's very similar to that word. Yeah,
it is.
Christos. I think Chrysos is gold, right?
Yeah.
So
and I'm not trying to sort of recreate what the English language sort of means. I'm just saying that they didn't use that word, that Hebrew word, as was written down. It was understood as Christos in Greek, which has an original Greek meaning that's not 100% aligned with Messiah. So And to me, it doesn't matter which term that you use. It's sort of how you understand and believe what that term means. So, and that's why, you've got Antichrist in there as well, which is, part of that understanding. And so you've got two different different kinds of understanding here, with the fisher as who's the gatherer of people and men on earth. And that's why, as a fisher king, you have that aspect of them also, as a shepherd king, as a fisher king, as looking after their kingdom. And when the land isn't producing, they go into all sorts of rituals to try and have fertility come back to the land. That's sort of all part of that. The fisher king that Jesus is trying to do is to collect the spirits of the people to get on a path back to God, right? That's a little bit sort of different sort of aspect of it. And Jesus, when he came, wasn't a king at the time, right? He was the Word made flesh, but he wasn't a king that was ruling.
Yeah.
He was there for a different part of his commission. He will come back as the ultimate king, right? And this is where the intertwining of the different lenses gets really interesting, because you're going to have Antichrist come back at the same time, or just before, right? And is going to try and do what Jesus said he's going to do. And of course, he's going to deny Jesus as being the true Christ. I mean, that's what an Antichrist does. So expect that that's what's going to happen. And so I look at the solar worship and the bloodlines of the Nephilim kings, and through the major dynasties that held these fisher king titles, these shepherd king titles, would be bloodlines of that Antichrist type line, which is the opposing sort of force as to who would like to rule the future time, right? And only one's going to win. And I'll let people decide which side that they're on. I'm obviously biased as being a Christian, but you have this understanding of Antichrist coming as being the king of Jerusalem, as setting himself up as God in the temple to be worshipped. He is like that demigod fisher king who's going to be king and priest, is how he's going to present himself. In fact, he's going to destroy Babylon and replace that religion with a new religion that his fathers didn't honor, that's going to worship him and Satan. And again, I would expect a female deity in that mix to make that sort of trinity. And so when we look at the meaning of it, there's similarities, but there are differences. And that's what makes trying to figure out what's going on and what side you want to pick a little bit more difficult, because you can make an argument that one is copying the other, right? I tend to make an argument from my biases that everything that God has done is being counterfeited. But I understand the argument from the other side that no, it's the monotheists that are doing the counterfeiting.
Yeah, no, I could see the case as well. You could see both, and I get it, but it's a controversial subject when you get into Jesus, because it's not about it. Research doesn't just get involved; that people belief systems get involved. So it's hard to get into it, because it's such an ingrained in people's beliefs. It's hard to contradict that with research.
So the first priest king, the first shepherd king after the flood, seems to be, again, from both sides, sort of looking at it, saying that was Nimrod at Babel. Right? He's king and he's head priest, and he introduces the mystical religion to the people and puts it on. He's an archetypical sun worshiping, because he's bringing in the Enochian mysticism that Hermes brings to him. So it's a sun worshiping cult, and he's king, and he looks at himself as a demigod, and many people believe he was a giant, and he's the head of the religion as well. And that's the allegory for the Babylon religion that's going to be replaced. And he's also an archetypical Antichrist figure because he's got complete control over all of the Noahites of that, of that particular period of time. And then he will, after Babel, stay in Sumeria and intermarry with the giants and create these great dynasties, right? That will start.
Yeah, you think this is why he changes? Like after, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. No. Do you think this is why he changes after the flood? Because before the flood, he wasn't really talked about as like a Nephilim type as much. After the flood, yeah, right? There seems to be like he's talked about more as a hybrid Nephilim or some type.
Yeah. So he, I think he probably takes a giant name, which is common.
It's too different.
Biblically, we understand him as the son of Cush. So he's not created from a biblical perspective to be a Nephilim, but he becomes Gibberim, a mighty one. And that word became, I think if I remember right, is the Hebrew chalal, which means to sort of break your vow, to split and drive a wedge. And so I think what's going on there is that knowledge that he gains is he's going to use that. He's going to break his vow to rule as a monotheist. He's going to try and he brings in the pantheon and worship that god. He's actually probably trying to get into the abyss to bring those ones sent to the abyss back, as you understand Akkadian as Bab as in gateway, and Elu or El as being gods, a gateway of the
Gate
gods.
Of the gods.
As opposed to confusion of languages that monotheists understand. Babel means that he was trying to get his gods back out that were sent to the prison. So he is receiving knowledge that is antediluvian, and it would make sense to me that might be how he managed to change things in his DNA or whatever that knowledge was to make him more mighty and stronger. And it's interesting because even the Septuagint actually calls him a giant, and that he made his reputation slaying giants as well at that time. So it's interesting that that's the first Fisher King after the flood. So yeah, I think something changes him, and it's more than just I'm going to become a polytheist. It's something physical that I think adds to it. There's a something in the book of Yashar and I don't trust the book of Yashar because it's highly corrupted, but it's an interesting story where he receives through inheritance, and then he's one who actually seizes it from Ham. Excuse me. Where that there's a story that after Adam and Eve leave Eden, they need clothes. So God makes clothes for them. And that this clothing provides extra strength because they're going out into this world where there's more than just them, which is, again, sort of strays away from the standard sort of version of Genesis. But it's these clothes that Nimrod steals that he wears that gives him this extra strength. I don't think it's that. I think that's more of a mystical allegory that's woven in, and there's a lot of mysticism in the book of Yashar. So, but what it does seem to agree on is that something changes, right? And this guy becomes a polytheist shepherd king, and continues with that as he sets up his dynasty in Sumer. And not that long afterwards, the Egyptian kings, again a solar cult, they're going to become priest kings as well as the pharaohs, as the fairy kings. Another interesting aspect that, as we connect into that with the giants, is that in Sumer the kings were made as intermediaries between the gods and earth, and so that was part of their function. And in the Ugaritic text, the kings carried out priestly functions and actually received revelations as the representative of the solar deity. And
well, let's get
those
into that.
kings were the Rephaim, who worship Baal and Ashtaroth, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's get into that, because that's kind of like the root of the war too, because we have these two sides basically that lead to all these dynasties being formed and breaking off into different branches, right?
Yeah.
You have when we talked about it on the radio show, and this is like their main goals, and the way they combat is through prayer and meditation a lot of times.
Yep.
You know, it's through ritual prayer and ritual combat and all of that. So we have the two sides, the Asura and the Deva Vedic war, right? So one of them is using that knowledge for meditation and ritual for the good of the collective consciousness, and the other one is using it to dominate and control and to get more power.
Yep.
Right. And then they split up into these different clans, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, the Asuras and the Devas. And then we have the priesthoods and the warriors, right? So that's how we get these different dynasties of these different solar cults.
Yeah. And it's dualism within a dualistic religion. Right?
Yeah.
Just as there's, and then just let me explain that for the audience. So just as a macro level, you have the pantheon fighting against this evil force of the universe, as they would call the God of the Bible. And just as we have the God of the Bible, who has had a rebellion go on with these fallen angels that we're witnessing is being sorted out even during our lifetimes, and will continue for at least a little bit anyways before that sorts itself out. And then you have within the pantheon, you have a good versus evil. You have white witches and evil witches. You have black sorcerers and white sorcerers, black magic and white magic, good heroes in Greek mythology and evil heroes. And it's a constant, right? So they're warring within as well for supremacy in terms of how the knowledge that the knowledge cult is about is going to be utilized, and does it benefit, and who's it going to benefit more, and however that goes, it sort of has an impact over to the humans that they rule, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the Brahmin class was supposed to be the ones that like shared the meditation and the rituals with humanity, with the collective. And then you got the other class, which is like
that has no use for the humans whatsoever.
Yeah, they want to protect the ritual and ward them off with violence and power. You know, they want to protect the knowledge. Yeah.
And for me, it doesn't really matter, because they're both polytheists, and whatever the good ones believe that they have in mind for humankind probably isn't the sort of ultimate freedom that I would like as a human. But that's again, I have to admit, that's my Christian biases coming in. But just so other people
agree.
out there that are listening, you need to sort of understand that they're still polytheists, whether or not you believe that's good or bad. They're both polytheists, as opposed to that macro dualism that's out there. And these kings and dynasties, and even within the black and the white, are going to have rivals all the way through, because they want their bloodline and dynasty to be the dominant one. So you have all of these beast empires through history. They're not interested in sharing power. They will have the representatives of those bloodlines at the court, which was quite common, particularly with let's say the Assyrian and the Babylonian and the Medes empires. They would all have bloodlines of these kings that they've made vassal kings at their court as representatives. But there can only be one. The rest can be part of the elite nobility in each of their visions, but there can only be one Antichrist type figure, one king, right? Just as there will be one Antichrist in the end time. And so these beast kingdoms are doing that throughout time. And even if you include these kingdoms outside of the biblical ones, let's say with the Tartarians, it's the same goal. They're trying to do the same thing. And what's really sort of interesting in terms of how that's sort of representative, I go back to a really interesting fairy allegory in a series called The Highlander, where there can only be one. And the allegory is the quickening, which is the same sort of idea as drinking blood, where you get energy and knowledge and the life force from an individual. But that whole story is about one bloodline that's going, that are immortals, that are going to rule forever, right? And
My my whole computer crashed. Never did that before. Never ever did that before.
are you
You know that?
are you recording right now?
Nope.
Okay.
I'm live on YouTube, but it's record. I'm not recording on Zoom anymore, but it's live on YouTube.
Okay. So I stopped because everything, so I wasn't sure whether or not.
Gary, is weird because I said remove somebody from the chat room because they were being rude.
Yeah.
In
And
the
it
chat
removed
room.
you.
And as soon as I said that, my computer went
Wow.
blank, crashed. So I don't know if they hacked me or did something, but then the Zoom file said, don't download and convert this Zoom file that you recorded. So I couldn't convert it. Yeah, I don't know what happened.
So are we broadcasting right now?
Yep, we're on YouTube.
Okay, good. So anyways, I was just sort of bringing that to full fruition with the Highlander series, and there can only be one. And I think that is, sort of a, a fairy tale as to what's been going on throughout time, only they're not wandering individuals. Actually, we're ruling kingships and dynasties all the way through. And we're going to start to see that play out. You're going to see many rise as world government is coming about, because they're going to want to have a bigger role, and eventually they're going to war and battle it out.
Yeah, that's intense. Yeah, it's pretty crazy what just happened too. I mean, the guy's name in the chat room was Cain.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up sometimes.
It's Kane, Cain.
Yeah.
And isn't it crazy too what's happening right now, Gary? I don't know if you realize, but on 4/22, they turned CERN back on for the first time in like 3 years, the Large Hadron Collider. And it was during 4 planets aligning in Aquarius.
Yeah.
Right. We just had like these they're aligning it like Saturn, all these, they're all aligning in a diagonal line with a comet and an asteroid in Aquarius right there. And you have CERN turning on at the same time during this.
Yeah, that's not a coincidence.
And another thing interesting about that is that same day, before I even knew the LHC was turned back on, I was in the sun for a minute, and it was 70 degrees in New York, nice day, but it was scorching hot, 70 degrees and scorching. The sun was making me sick.
Wow.
So at the same time that they turned LHC, the sun was having weird effects. Like I felt sick. I felt like I was getting radiation poisoning sitting in the sun. So yeah, you can't make this all up. I mean, this is definitely all connected. And when you talk about Nimrod and something that's trying to pierce the veil of heaven, right? I mean, could this be similar to what we're talking about at CERN?
Yeah, I think so. We've got AI and we've got quantum computing that's merged together there, and that's designed to search in the multiverse, multiple searches at one time using the AI, and quantum computing gets you into other dimensions. So that has the capability to do more than just what they say that they're doing. And typically, as we understand where the abyss is, the abyss prison. It's in the underworld or Hades or Sheol, and that's in another dimension. Just as we were talking about the Repiu and the Rephaim of the Ugaritic text, just as the gods went back and forth in the portals between the underworld and the physical world, so did the Rephaim kings. And so it seems that they may be very well looking for the destroyer god, which is why you have the Shiva imagery that is all around CERN and all of the crazy rituals you see some of the employees and things that are doing that are really sort of kind of creepy. And so Abaddon, Apollyon are in the abyss, that I think is the destroyer of the antediluvian world. Azazel as the leader of the hosts, as the book of Enoch talks about, and as the destroyer of Babylon, Abad, which is the root word for Abaddon in Jeremiah 51. That this is going to be the god that Antichrist honors, I think, and that is the Hebrew word Maus as the god of forces in the book of Daniel, and that goes back to a series of words like as and az, which is the first part of the name for Azazel. And the son of perdition is a Greek word for destroyer, just as Abaddon means destroyer god, and Antichrist is the son of perdition. And perdition is part of the group of words that produces Apollyon, and it means, and there's a direct sort of connection to it, that this is definitely, as the son of perdition, we're getting a connection to the destroyer god, whether or not that's a descendant, as a bloodline descendant, or it's just going to be a god that he's going to honor because that individual is going to be released out of the abyss in Revelation 9. And this is the one that's going to take down the two witnesses. And this is how Antichrist is also described, that, he's the one that once was, now is not, and comes up out of the abyss, right? Yeah. So there's a connection between him as the son of perdition, and he's going to perdition. So I think that, as Antichrist and Nimrod are similar types of archetype type figures, and Antichrist ultimately becomes the ultimate one that succeeds, they have the same goal. So just as, Babel was a gateway to the gods that he made, I think he was trying to get into the abyss. I think that's ultimately what's going to happen, so that Antichrist can have that extra sort of warrior capability, even though he receives the power from the dragon. We don't know whether or not that meaning Satan, or that's the seven empires, because he's sort of handed over control. You could interpret that a number of different ways. But I do think that all of the imagery, all of the words are about CERN, with CERN also being, as we've talked about in shows past, I think it's out of the Etruscan pantheon, or the Roman Empire. Roman pantheon is a nature goat god, just as Azazel is depicted as a goat god, just as Bacchus out of the Roman pantheon is, just as Pan god is. Yeah. Pan and several other ones in the Greek mythology, and Cernunnos out of the Druidic pantheon. Baphomet, which is the god the Templars worshipped, is also a goat god. I think there's a relationship there as well, and that's, of course, as a satyr god, which are degraded watchers.
And this is where the inverted pentagram comes from, that goat of Mendes. That's the actual goat, the beard and everything.
In the goat of Mendes in Egypt, where black magic and alchemy comes out of that whole sort of historical etymology. So
the Kemetic and all that. Yeah, the Kemetic lines and all that.
Yeah. So and if you break the word satyr down, you've got a compound word, and the last one is ear, which means watcher, as it's used as watcher in Hebrew in Daniel 4 times, and Sa'ah, or S-A, is part of a larger word that's been contracted in there that means hairy. So this means a hairy watcher, which again, or a shaggy watcher, which is a description of a devil goat god as it comes out of the Bible.
It almost sometimes seems like they're describing a hairy star, like a comet as well. sometimes. It could be looked at as different things, like something coming from the heavens, and because a
Well,
star, a
yeah,
comet is called a hairy one. That's what comet means.
yeah,
The word
exactly.
cometos.
And what's sort of interesting from that is we all presume that Azazel, Abaddon, Apollyon is chained in the abyss, right? But it doesn't actually say that in the book of Enoch. And it doesn't say that in Revelation 9. I mean, the hosts of Azazel are in the abyss.
Yeah.
And out of the smoke comes all of these scorpion beings, which has a king over them named Abaddon and Apollyon. So he may be somewhere else. And also we see the star that falls from the sky. And typically it's an angel from heaven that's, are doing all of these things, but we don't know that this is a falling star. And in the occult version is that Azazel is not in the abyss. He's chained in Orion.
Yeah.
So if that were the case, and I'm just connecting dots as a plausibility, he could be that star that falls. But I'm open to either way. It's either an angel from God that's going to open up the abyss so things can be fulfilled, or somehow Azazel is released and he gets into the abyss and releases these scorpion beings.
Yeah, that's very interesting to get into. I mean, even what we mentioned the other day on the radio last week when we were on the radio together, when we're talking about these clans appearing after the flood and Nephilim reemerging after the flood and how they survived, and then you talking about a second incursion that could have possibly happened. It does explain it's a way of explaining a lot of stuff that makes sense.
Yep.
And I was wondering, could have there been other excursions at different spots, and what spots could have these been? And then how these excursions could have happened. And even if they're actually talking about physical, tangible beings coming from the heavens, or they're talking about something being transported like a meteorite or something. Because in angel, we get that term from angelos, right? The Greek angelos.
Yep.
That means like a messenger from the heavens, kind of.
Yes.
So that could also mean,
and an angel is a messenger in Hebrew as well, as it's defined.
Yeah. So I always wondered, could it be?
But also as a spirit.
Even the 200 fallen angels, could have they been like 200 meteorites coming down, falling near Mount Hermon, and then each one of those meteorites had something contained in it that brought people knowledge of sciences, knowledge of this, knowledge of that, knowledge. It could have even been that.
Well, as a falling star, they would be represented being expelled out of heaven. They would probably be seen like a
meteorite,
a meteor, as a description, right? As opposed to being a physical meteor, right? But they would certainly have that appearance as they all fell down.
Wow.
And so when you have the creation of the Nephilim before the flood, what we're told about is that it's when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and they do so again, but it doesn't say when. So there would have been multiple sort of incursions before the flood, but it also implies that could also mean after the flood that this happens again. And in the Gnostic and we again in the book of Enoch, we're not told, and in the Bible, we're not told where they're created. We know that the oath out of the book of Enoch, where they swear to do this, is done on Mount Hermon, but it doesn't say they were created there. We just sort of assume that's probably where they did it, but they could have gone to many locations. In the Gnostics, in several of their books, like the Secrets According to John or the Tablets of Seth and other ones, as my memory goes, there's several different books that they say that Nephilim were first created from this region of the world, let's put it that way, at Gomorrah, and then after the flood at Sodom. So they're first created then, and then their seeds replanted at Sodom afterwards. And so
it's interesting too with Sodom and Gomorrah, because is it like as far from what I understand from reading it, Abraham was sort of convinced that the Queen of Heavens had power, and then God sort of makes a covenant with Abraham to show him, hey, I'm more powerful, and he sends even that burning lamp type thing down, meteorite type thing, right down to show him,
Yeah.
right between the two sacrifices.
Yeah.
Between the,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, so there's there's a lot of things that are going on in in and around
Yeah.
this sort of period of time, but it indicates from their perspective that there is a second incursion, as well as in other accounts like Epic of Gilgamesh. You get both, with
Yeah.
Gilgamesh being created after the flood, but Pishtin and all of his family, they are survivors of the flood, and they're 2/3 God, 1/3 human. Or in the legends of Idzubar, it's the same legends, it's just different names, and Ziazudra would be the Noah sort of equivalent. But back to the second incursion aspect of it, is that doesn't mean that there wasn't incursions elsewhere. And we get told of 7 holy mountains as part of polytheist history around the world. And so one might imagine that in those 7 cult centers or 7 mountains within that area, you might have incursions all around the world. I mean,
like how Shiva sits at Mount Kailash.
Yeah.
So
we don't know how many that there were, but one expects that there was more than just one time that giants were created before the flood, because we know, well, from a biblical perspective, that it says there was at least more than one encounter of that type of thing. So, and again, if there's a second incursion, you would expect that would be multiples and on different sort of areas of the world.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if our, because I mean, we've been mapping it. It seems like after the flood, the first place where astrology emerges as a science is Persia, Chaldea, along the Euphrates River, right? So there's a reason why they were mapping out the stars mathematically. They needed to know what was coming, and what was coming that can either kill you or affect you, right? It wasn't just a stargaze. They were taking it serious.
Particularly that they were so close to the flood. And in a lot of the legends that come out of Sumeria and elsewhere around the world is there were 3 stars of the Pleiades that crash into the oceans that starts the conflagration of events that we understand as the flood catastrophe. So if that's the case, then they would be wanting to have that kind of information, as well as for all sorts of other reasons in terms of developing a civilization and stuff like that. They need to
this would
understand
give
the seasons and things. Yeah.
This possibly what the Persian Magi, the Persian Magi had like secret knowledge into Jesus's arrival, even new star appearing in heaven. They had this knowledge. So maybe the reason why they're all stationed on Mount Graham, Gary, because for people that don't know, Gary, of course, knows, on Mount Graham, we have the Vatican, we have NASA, all these big, huge telescopes right in this one area of Mount Graham, which is a holy area to the natives, right? And maybe they're privy to another incursion coming on a specific mountain.
Yeah, maybe they are. And the thing that we do know is they have, large telescopes there, and many of them, right? And the Vatican has the largest one that they originally named Lucifer, but now they call it Lucy, which is equally bad, because Lucy, like, let's say in the Narnia tales, has her I think her genealogy goes back to Lilith. So
that's some people think that's like the first prototype of a human was the Lucy. Remember the Lucy?
Exactly. So and for the Chiricahua Apache, I mean, that's one of their sacred mountains.
Yes. Well, they actually call these mountain spirits the Gone. The Gone. They have these mountain spirits that protect the wormhole between the mountain and the stars. Supposedly there's a gateway there, and they call these mountain spirits the Gone. Gahn, I think they're called.
So in that line of thought is that this wormhole begins somewhere out in space that will come to the Earth, as I understand it. And I think that's what they've got these telescopes sort of set up for, because they're in this line of thought. I don't know whether any of it's true or not. They're expecting a wormhole or a visitation or a return of the gods, however you want to understand it. And it would make sense too, because I mean, not only is this a sacred place, it's a place of pilgrimages that were part of the Apache, that they would pilgrim there. And typically those are places where people have ascended to heaven, come back from heaven. It's sort of that worldwide sort of legacy that's where you do pilgrimages to. So it's just kind of interesting.
No
Yeah.
baloney Mahoney in the chat room says Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And
Yeah.
you have to also understand that the Vatican's telescope and astronomy projects are run by the Jesuits. And the Jesuits have been studying astronomy since their beginning. They are astronomers as part of their masteries of the 7 sacred sciences that they interpret everything through.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. And that everything with the 7 mountains, the 7 sciences, maybe that's related,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It's gotta be. Yeah. It's really amazing. Really amazing. And recently I was doing some work on my Patreon actually about a spot in Bulgaria. Bulgaria is like a really ancient area too that most people don't talk about. And Baba Vanga was a prophet. You probably heard of Baba Vanga. She was a prophet that went blind when she was 12 years old because a tornado picked her up off the ground and threw her in a field, and she went blind from getting deposited into the soil. It like messed her eyes up, and she ended up starting having hypersensitivity and was getting visions. And she started putting prophecies and stuff. So she started having some of these prophecies, and one of them, they had a remote view, sort of like a map. And I think in 1989 there was some political changes in Bulgaria that brought out some memoirs of like a KGB agent, and they talked about a tomb in I think the name is called Stranya. Stranya is the name of the town. Stranya. And supposedly there's a cave there where there's they called it the tomb of Bastet, but it was some like Nephilim queen type description, like a tall black-haired race that, and I was like, maybe this is a Hyksos queen that was buried there or something like that. Yeah. And when they went in there, Gary, the lady that went in there was a psychic who first went in. She was working with the Secret Service that went in there, and they died of radiation poisoning. They sealed it up with concrete.
Wow.
Yep. I don't know how true it is, but that was what I heard.
Yeah. Crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. You could find it in a book on Bulgarian mysteries by Andrei Kudin. The guy's name is Andrei Kudin. He talks about it, but it's very interesting. In Bulgaria too, as well, because it seems like the Hyksos or those Solar Dynasty lines, they were all over the whole earth. It wasn't just in the Near East, it was all over.
Yeah, and it's just impossible to have the same type of religion, the same type of pantheon, and it just doesn't happen coincidentally that way. So the names change from a vernacular. I think they're the same pantheon of gods all around the world. So they have the same responsibilities and the same sort of positions. There's a few nominal changes here or there, but nothing all that significant. And that sun worship is at the center of it all.
Yeah. We have a shout out to Shelly Meyer in the chat room. She gave a donation. She has a question with her donation. We'll field it to Gary. I just have one comment on it. The question's wondering about Rudolf Steiner's idea about Ahriman being the Antichrist. Any thoughts on this? I've read Rudolf Steiner. For me, Gary, I thought Ahriman is Ahura Mazda. I don't know if you get that, because he has a god sort of Antichrist type figure called Ahirman. I equivalent that to Ahura Mazda. I don't know if you do as well, but
yeah, it's basically Ahriman. It comes out of the a version of the Zoroastrian or Aryan religion, right? Ahriman. Yeah. And that would be, very much a classification and because you have that Ahura Mazda, right? And that's kind of where I'm kind of linking it back. Did I get the spelling on that right? Can you give that to me one more time?
It's AH.
Yeah.
RIMAN, I think.
Yeah, Ahriman. Yeah, that's a transliteration of the Ahura Mazda. So it is, it's also part of the Ormuzd belief system that comes out of Egypt, and it's all meaning sort of the same sort of individual. And yeah, I think it's an Antichrist type figure of ages past, or more the Antichrist spirit is how I would sort of understand it. And we're told there's a spirit of the Antichrist that's always with us. So,
and I think that Rudolf Steiner talked about an age of Archangel Michael and an age of Mammon. So I think Mammon is sort of like Ahriman. It's like one. It's like they're. It's like an Antichrist, Mammon, Ahriman, and I think that we're supposed to be in that age right now. It's a war versus Mammon, which is like materialism and all of that stuff going on.
So most of the Antichrist type figures receive an incarnation. And that's where you have a god that is going to be the avatar, and the Antichrist is going to be the avatara, just as receive the wisdom and things like that. So typically, and particularly in the New Age, they're looking at this incarnation that's going to be of the coming Christ figure, which and so I would be looking for something like that, because again, even from an Antichrist in the Bible, we understand he's going to receive power from the dragon, and he's going to receive a mortal head wound. So he's going to, have a resurrection, and he's going to have additional powers. So it would make sense to me that's going to happen, and we ought to be aware that there's going to be multiple antichrists. That's the thing that's going to really make it confusing. And there's going to be, everybody's going to lap onto the first one that comes along, just like they like to call every president that comes along an antichrist. So it's going to get quite confusing.
It's the same as Baal, Baal, Mammon. It would be the same one, I would think. It would be the same similar type of thing.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a good question, and but again, I would sort of understand it as more of an incarnation. And who knows? I mean, we could see, and it could take a number of decades once these things start to come about, and it could be more like the birth pangs. It's just going to get stronger and worse as it goes through. And certainly by the time that Antichrist comes along, I mean, everybody's going to say, no, this has to be the Antichrist. So everything's sort of set up.
Yeah.
So that he can do it just before the coming, from a Christian perspective, just before the coming of Jesus at Armageddon.
Yep. That's really amazing. I mean, it's incredible. And there's not just going to be one, I don't think either. There's going to be a succession of them.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So
that's important to let people know there's going to be numerous ones.
Well, and almost every religion has this understanding of this end time Messiah. So whether or not it's the Mahdi of the Muslims, or I think that's the Shia Muslim. There's also one that is of the Sunni. I think it's Isa, is what they call it. And you've got Lord Maitreya, you've got Buddha, you've got the Grand Monarch. There's so many different names that people would apply to this, that they're all going to be rivaling, and that's going to be what really causes things to be super chaotic. So we're just starting to see the empires start to form with the trading blocks, and that look for individuals that are heading those nations, that are collecting groups of nations that will be Antichrist type figures. But the first one won't be the Antichrist.
Yeah. It's important to realize what the scriptures say, everybody out there. And guys, also check out genesis6conspiracy.com. That is where you can find Gary's book as well. And if anybody has any more questions, we got one more question in the chat room, I think, too. Is the Antichrist an unholy trinity? After that, we'll go that after that, and we'll do the next show on King Arthur and all that as well. That would be a good show.
Yeah, that's a very, very good show. So is the Antichrist an unholy trinity? It would be part of that. So again, if you can imagine that there are similarities in both polytheism and in monotheism, and one would expect that there will be a Trinity sort of setup. So there's an allegory in Gnosticism of the Masons that would use as an allegory of that Trinity as using offspring gods, Osiris, Isis, and Horus the sun. Was Horus would be an Antichrist type figure in that sort of scenario. So we know that Satan and Antichrist will be worshipped in the last 3.5 years. I expect there's a mother goddess that gets worshipped at the same time to complete that sort of Trinity. And so, however they sort of bring that about and how it sort of represents, Satan would have had a partner at some point in time. So whoever you want to look at that as a Sophia or whomever, expect that there's going to be a parent goddess type of duality that's also coming with Babylon, but will also be there with Satan and Antichrist.
That's a really good answer. And guys, check out Mr. Gary Wayne, Genesis6conspiracy.com. Also, me and Gary will be part of the Nephilim conference in October in the UK. You can contact us if you want information about that as well. And of course, pick up the book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Guys, it's been a great time, Gary. I want to appreciate you always. It's always a pleasure having you, my friend.
Terrific. Thank you for having me. And hopefully we gave the audience something to think about today.
Yeah, it was good. It was amazing. And you know what? I think that people out there, fall back. I think you're being attacked, Gary. I could feel it. Even when you come on, like, people are trying to attack the information that you're putting out there, and I could tell. So that's a sign that you're on the right path. Don't be detracted from that in any way, because that means that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're saying you're affecting people. That means you got some truth going on.
Yeah, it's amazing how many things happen. It's kind of crazy,
right?
Yeah.
And it seems like it always just happens to you a lot of times, mostly with you and myself as well. Myself as well. But yeah, thanks, Gary. I'm on your side, buddy, right here. And we got a chat room that loves you and a lot of people that love you out there. So thank you for coming, and you are a legend.